Well, good afternoon everybody and welcome to the latest live event from the Save Wemyss Ancient Cave Society. I'm Mike Arrowsmith, the current chair of SWACS, and I'll be hosting today's live question and answer session which will follow the presentation, which is Recent Archaeological Discoveries at the Wemyss Caves with Jo Hambly. This presentation was recorded a couple of days ago, but Jo will be joining us live in about half an hour to answer any questions you may have about archaeology at the caves, or indeed anything else that you want to ask about the site. So while the presentation is playing, please post any questions in the chat and Jo will do her best to answer them at the end. So without any more from me, here's Jo on recent archaeological discoveries at the Wemyss Caves.
Hello and welcome to this online talk. My name is Jo Hambly, that's me. I'm an archaeologist. I work with the SCAPE Trust at the University of St Andrews and I'm a member of the Save the Wemyss Ancient Cave Society. Over the next half an hour or so, I'm going to tell you about the results so far from our community excavations last summer at the Wemyss Caves and try and put them into a bit of context for you. And this is still very much a work in progress. The excavations are a partnership between ourselves and SWACS, with contributions by the University of Aberdeen's Comparative Kingship project. If you're not familiar with the Wemyss Caves, I highly recommend you take this virtual tour until you can come in person, and you'll find this on the SWACS Facebook under videos. Also, here's a link to a talk that I gave last summer, which gives you much more information about the wider context of the Wemyss Caves in relation to other 5 caves and other caves in Scotland. And Gordon Noble gave a talk last summer introducing a lot of new archaeological information about Pictish symbols. So I highly recommend, if you haven't done so already, to take a look at all those resources. Now, the Wemyss Caves are very well known because of the remarkable collection of Pictish symbols that we find carved into the walls of some of the caves along this coastline. So in this image, the caves marked in yellow contain Pictish carvings. So that's Court Cave, the West Dew Cave, which collapsed in 1914, Jonathan's Cave and Sliding Cave. And of course, there's lots of other interesting history and archaeology associated with the Wemyss Caves, from the medieval period right through to much more recent uses of the caves. So there has been quite a bit of archaeology at the Wemyss Caves in the past, and this slide summarises all of the archaeological interventions that we know about that have taken place since the 1980s. So the red areas are the caves themselves, and then the yellow, the blue, the green and the white are the locations of archaeological trenches. But there has also been antiquarian diggings, as you can see here, and other activities that have disturbed deposits inside the caves that we don't know anything about. And so an awful lot of information has been lost. This slide summarises what we know about the archaeology of the Wemyss Caves. In the Iron Age, people were farming here and so presumably living close by. In the medieval period, people were living here. We find their food remains and pottery, and they're also burying their dead here. We have less information about the archaeology inside the caves because a lot of them have been very disturbed, as we've mentioned before. So excavations by the time team in 2004 showed that in Jonathan's Cave and the Well Cave, the deposits were pretty shallow and mainly modern, although medieval pottery was found in the Well Cave. The Sliding Cave, however, was more promising, and underneath quite mixed deposits, they found an undisturbed horizon containing lots of burnt material, and they got a radiocarbon date out of that, dating from the 3rd to the 4th century AD. So at the time, this was interpreted as reflecting activity that probably predated the carving of the Pictish symbols that we find in Sliding Cave. Now, since 2004, there's been a lot of new information about the archaeological context of the use of Pictish symbols. And this is largely through the work of Gordon Noble at the University of Aberdeen. And there's also been more work by Ian Armitt when he was at the University of Bradford on the Sculptor's Cave in Murray, which is the only other cave in Scotland that contains a significant collection of Pictish carvings. SWACS are also really interested in furthering the understanding of the caves and using them as a research resource. So it was a very good time to revisit the archaeology of the Wemyss caves. And these were our main questions that we were focused on answering in our excavations last year. So first of all, to our knowledge, there's been no modern archaeological excavations inside the Court Cave and the Dew Cave, so we know absolutely nothing about the deposits inside them. So we wanted to know more about that. Secondly, SWACS would like to create an accessible path linking the 5 coastal path into the Court Cave, because the Court Cave is the nearest cave to East Wemyss, so it's already the most accessible. So in order to do this, we need to know what's under the ground so that we don't inadvertently damage any surviving archaeology. And thirdly, Sliding Cave is the most vulnerable to coastal erosion and the only cave that we know has undisturbed archaeological deposits that date to the Pictish period. So it's very important that we know as much about them as possible. And we also wanted to get more information about their character and, if possible, collect more samples for radiocarbon dating. And this has the greatest potential to answer wider research questions about the origin and the dating of Pictish symbols. We gained scheduled monument consent from Historic Environment Scotland because these caves are protected by law to dig test pits in Court Cave, Dew Cave and Sliding Cave. And we also investigated the promontory next to MacDuff's castle, and with the Edinburgh Archaeological Field Society carried out geophysics in the cemetery. Now, both the cemetery geophysics and the promontory excavations were inconclusive, and I don't have time to talk about them now, but I'll give you a link to the report at the end of this talk so you can download it and go through all the results. So let's jump in. I'll go cave by cave, giving you the results and a bit of discussion, and let's start with Court Cave. Now, here's a plan of Court Cave. The red is the scheduled area, which more or less coincides with the inside of the cave, and the green are the test pits that we excavated. And here's some of our Court Cave team. We'll start at test pit 3, which is located in front of the panel of Pictish carvings in the Court Cave. Michael is using a mattock to get through the highly compacted deposits that make up the present-day cave floor. And you can see just at the base of the cave wall, the bedrock is curving round to form the floor. So we weren't expecting the deposits to be very deep, and this turned out to be the case. Here's a section through them. 112 is actually natural deposits. So above that, we've got thin, very compacted layers of trample, mainly made up of coal dust. These are all the finds that we found within this 1 metre by 1 metre test pit. We might have a bit of a leather bootlace on the right-hand side, what looks like a bundle of matchsticks, a bit of clay pipe and some modern glass and what looks like roof tile. So let's go to Trench 2, which was located just inside the main entrance to Court Cave. And here we have Sue and Diana excavating through these very, very compacted layers. Let's look at them in close-up. You can see the dark colour is a result of coal dust, and these layers contained mostly 19th century and early 20th century material. And it's very tempting to link these layers with the known use of Court Cave by miners for playing a gambling game where you toss 2 pennies up in the air and bet on the outcome. And I like to think of decades of coal dust trodden in from miners' boots has resulted in these incredibly compact upper layers. But the story doesn't quite end there, because right at the base of the trench, just in a small hollow in the smooth bedrock, Sue and Diana found this pottery. And it's medieval pottery. So the larger bits are an English import dating from the 1200s to the 1300s. And the smaller piece is what we call Scottish white gritty ware, and that more or less dates to the same period. It might be slightly later. Now, the finding of medieval pottery just preserved right on the bedrock floor like this is really significant, because it tells us that Cork Cave was kept very clean until probably right into the 19th century. It looks like it had a smooth bedrock floor. It would have been swept out regularly. And this isn't unusual because the cave was probably used for a whole variety of activities in the past, including workshops, stabling for animals, gatherings of people, hence the name Cork Cave. And we actually have local historical documentation that refers to this cave as the Bark Cave, because it was used by fishermen to dry their nets after dipping them in preservative made out of tree bark. So let's go outside the cave to test pit 1, which was located just in the entrance of the cave. And this very deep hole was dug by Chris and Jamie, and their effort really paid off with the discoveries from this trench. Unlike the test pits in the Cork Cave, this one was very deep, and the lower metre or so of it was full of archaeological material, what we call midden. So these are mostly food remains. Here we see animal bone, shellfish, also pottery, and the green is the pottery, and then the dark red lumps are debris from ironworking. Now, all of this material had been deposited directly upon the wave-cut bedrock platform, which we found right at the bottom of the trench. And it was all mixed up with soil that we call colluvium, which is just slope wash, which is like come down, washed down the slope over the years. We had a date from an animal bone, which was lying on the bedrock of 561 to 651 AD, so that's Pictish, by the way. And we also had medieval pottery at the top of the sequence. So we know that this material was built up over a very, very long period of time. And it was pretty mixed, but there was absolutely nothing modern or even post-medieval in it. So we know it's intact, it hasn't been disturbed. So let's have a look at some of the finds. Firstly, the bone assemblage. Here we have a real mix of domesticates like sheep and cattle and pig with wild animals. Here we've got hare, otter and grey seal. So possibly some of these animals were being exploited for their fur, for their pelts. And that's a piece of a cattle foot that we got the radiocarbon date from. As was the case inside the cave, the pottery found in this trench was not local. It was another English import dating from the 1300s to the 1400s. And it's interesting that all previous medieval pottery found in earlier excavations at the Wemyss caves have all been Scottish. They've all been Scottish white gritty ware, so the Cork Cave assemblage is unusual. Now, these unprepossessing lumps are the residues from ironworking, and they were looked at by Gemma Cruikshanks from the National Museum of Scotland, and she says the pieces are too fragmentary to distinguish which part of the process they derive from, although one fragment is probably blue, suggesting smelting or primary smithing, bloom refining were taking place. So this is bloom. It's the mass of molten iron which comes out of a furnace as the product of smelting, and it's hammered immediately to bash off some of the impurities that are sticking to its surface. Now, as well as a fragment of bloom, we found this piece. It's a cylinder of fired clay, and you can see it's vitrified, or it looks glassy at one end. Now, this is the remains of a tuyere, and a tuyere is the end of the bellows which forced air into a furnace or into a smithing hearth. And here's the type of furnace that would have been used to make iron in the late Iron Age right into the early medieval and medieval period. And the red circle is the tuyere, the bit that we found, and then the red stars denoting all the bits that we found in our assemblage. So we've got the tuyere, we've got a bit of bloom, and we have plenty of slag. So this really confirms that we have metalworking in the Cork Cave, probably in the medieval period, possibly slightly earlier. So why didn't we find any metalworking evidence inside the Cork Cave? Well, because as we know already, it would have been kept very clean, and all the midden material in Trench 1 almost certainly originates from activities that were taking place inside the caves. Now, this is really interesting because although there is quite a bit of evidence for metalworking taking place inside caves and rock shelters, hardly any of it is dated. There is a recent exception to that, the Smelters Cave, part of the Rosemarkie Cave complex on the Black Isle, where an in situ smelting hearth was found and radiocarbon dated to 600 to 800 AD. And this is a result of great work carried out by the Rosemarkie Caves project. Now, our iron smelting evidence isn't precisely dated, and so we're going to try and date the Tuyeres itself using a scientific dating method called thermoluminescence, which will tell us when it was last heated to a very high temperature, and hopefully that will narrow down the date of the ironworking taking place in Court Cave for us. So next we come to the Dew Cave, and this cave is so called because inside it's full of these rock-cut nesting boxes for pigeons. Here's a photograph of the cave taken around 1900, and you can see that then the entrance to the cave was blocked up with just small holes at the top for the birds to fly in and out of. Until the 18th century, pigeons were kept for meat to take people through the winter. By people, I mean rich people. This cave was almost certainly belonged to MacDuff's castle. And the use of caves as pigeon houses was pretty common in medieval Britain, but especially modified ones like this one are incredibly rare. So we wanted to know more about the deposits inside it, whether we could link any archaeology in it to the medieval use of the Dew Cave, or even find something about its use before it was modified as a Dew Cave. Here's our crack Dew Cave team, Tom, Kirsty and Hannah, and also Charlie, who's not pictured here. And between them they shifted a huge amount of soil. Here's a plan of the cave. So the green trench is the trench that was excavated, located at the back of the cave. And we knew the trench had to be big enough to get through what we knew were very deep deposits inside the Dew Cave. So here's the trench following its excavation, and that's a metre scale in the bottom of the trench. So the deposits were very deep indeed. And at the base of the trench, this is the bedrock floor of the cave. And you can see that we encountered more of these rock-cut niches carved into the floor of the cave. So here's another view of these niches. They appear to be carved in the same fashion as the nesting boxes in the cave walls, and they're probably contemporary with them, almost certainly contemporary with them, but they wouldn't have functioned, or they couldn't have functioned as nesting boxes. And our best guess is that they're supports for some sort of wooden structure or framework which was once inside the cave. And you do get potence ladders in circular ducats, but a potence ladder wouldn't have worked in an irregular cave setting. So we really have no idea what they're for. If any of you listening know more about this, we'd be really very happy to hear from you. So they're also not mentioned in any of the antiquarian accounts of the Dew Cave, which was surveyed in 1890. So the structure didn't exist then, and the holes were obviously not visible, so they must have been filled in by then. A second conundrum was that the primary deposits filling these floor niches was beach sand, and we also found a piece of corrugated iron right close to the bedrock. So this shows that it was modern deposits that were filling the cave floor, and that at some point the sea must have come in and washed away all existing deposits. Now, we've seen this photograph before. In 1900, we know that there was a wall blocking the entrance to the Dew Cave, so the sea couldn't have got in prior to this date. This photograph was taken in the 50s or early 60s, and here you see the cave mouth is open, so the sea must have come in between those two times. And here we have Frank Rankin remembering a fierce storm in 1945, which he reports washed away the seawall and the grassy bank in front of the cave, the Dew Cave, broke down the wall which sealed off the entrance to East Dew Cave, so that the cave is now open to the shore. So this must be the event that resulted in the scouring out of all the archaeological deposits in the Dew Cave. So disappointing in one sense, but also lots to think about in another sense of what a medieval dew cave may have looked like and what sort of structures existed inside them. So finally to the sliding cave. We opened up 2 trenches in the sliding cave. 1A is the original time team trench, and a second one further into the caves to see if deposits extended further back. The sliding cave contains these Pictish symbols: a double disc, 2 rectangle symbols, one with an internal decoration which looks like a double disc, and then these squiggles or snake-like forms which are probably Pictish. And this is the cave where the time team recovered their date from this undisturbed archaeological layer of the 3rd to the 4th century AD, which is within the historic Pictish period. Here's Gordon and Sue taking more samples from the original time team trench. And here's trench 2, which was located underneath the rectangle symbols. This drawing and the photograph give you a sense of the deposits that are filling the sliding cave. So at the base you've got a boulder layer, which is probably natural, and that's covered by a dark layer which contains a lot of charred material, and that's our archaeological layer. Above that we have what appears to be naturally deposited material from inwash and the occasional roof collapse possibly, but all of these layers are still under investigation, so we'll get more information out of them in time. Now, one of the main objectives of the excavations in the sliding cave was to sample for more radiocarbon dating. So let's have a look at the results. Here's all of the dates that we had back from samples that were submitted from archaeological layers that were the same as the one excavated by the time team in 2004. And also this orange layer is a new layer, and that was found by Gordon and James underneath the time team layer. But you can see that the spread of the radiocarbon dates from around 30 AD right through to 616 AD is showing that this layer probably built up over quite a long period of time, and all falls within what we would call the late Iron Age or the very early medieval period, looking at that later date. So here's the dates presented stratigraphically. All the dates returned from the yellow layer and from the orange layer. And each date is presented as the likelihood of it falling within an age range. And you can see there's a huge amount of overlap between them. Taken together, they more or less, all of them fall between 50 and 600 AD. If we remove the outlier, they all fall between 50 and 400 AD. And even if we include the outlier, the probability of the dates falling between 50 and 500 AD is very high. So what this is telling us about the archaeological layer that they came from is that it's likely that the layer formed over this period between around 50 and 500 AD. To put all this into some sort of context, let's first go to Dunaker, which is a site around 20 miles south of Aberdeen. This site was excavated by Gordon Noble a couple of years ago. It's now a sea stack. It was probably a promontory fort, and it's famous for plaques of carved Pictish symbols discovered in the early 19th century, assumed to once have been part of the rampart wall of the fort. And if you want to know more about this fascinating site, watch Gordon's talk that I mentioned at the start of this one. What's of interest to us at the Wemyss Caves is the absolute remarkable similarity of carvings between those found at Dunaker with those found at Wemyss. Some of them are pretty much almost identical. Radiocarbon dates from the excavations at Dunaker showed that the fort was occupied between 200 and 400 AD, and that the rampart was probably constructed between 285 and 350 AD. Remember, this is the rampart wall that contained the plaques with Pictish symbols carved into them. So these are very similar to the dates that we had from the archaeological deposits in Sliding Cave. I want to throw one more site into the mix. This is Sculptor's Cave on the Murray coastline. It's the only other cave in Scotland that contains a significant assemblage of Pictish symbols carved into the cave walls. If we compare the Pictish symbols carved into the sculptor's cave with symbols carved into some of the Wemyss caves, again we can see remarkable similarities between the two. Now, Sculptor's Cave has a very grisly archaeological story. It was first excavated in the 1920s and then again in the 1970s, and thousands of fragments of human bone along with Bronze Age material and Roman material were recovered. So it looks like it was used as a mortuary cave, probably in the Bronze Age. Amongst the human bone were human vertebrae which had sword cut marks through them as a result of beheading of individuals or decapitation. Recent work by Ian Armitt and his team at Bradford University has reassessed all of this historic archaeological material and also radiocarbon dated a lot of the human bone and some of the animal bone that was found. Ian discovered that the decapitations were from at least 6 individuals, 4 adults and 2 teenagers, and they were killed between 220 and 335 AD. The decapitations could have been a single event and may have represented executions in a place of ritual significance during a time period in which the first historical mention of the Picts is made, so that's from 297 AD. Although he goes on to say that the symbols carved around the cave entrance passages are unlikely to date much before the 6th century AD. But in the light of new dating evidence from the other 2 sites, which have very similar symbols, Dunaker and Wemyss, it seems equally plausible that the carvings of the symbols in the sculptor's cave may be contemporary or near contemporary with the killings. Finally, here's a reminder that the research process is always that of building on what has come before. This map is from a short article in the Pictish Art Society Journal of 1996, drawing attention to the similarities of Pictish symbol carvings between the 3 sites that we've been exploring. And Leslie Alcock, who wrote the article, concluded that the differences between the symbols in caves and on the Dunaker plaques on the one hand, and those on slabs and boulders in the open air on the other, have been treated here as evidence that a varied range of pictographs might be ancestral to the canonical Class 1 symbols. In his article, Leslie Alcock argued that the variable symbols found in cave contexts and at Dunaker probably predated the much more formalised symbols represented on the standing stones. And at the time he was going against a theory that the carvings found in places like the Wemyss caves were a later and debased form of Pictish carving. So our current contribution to this research and to his theory is the scientific dating that is allowing us to unpick the timing of the origin of the first use of the Pictish symbols, and also to better understand the range of circumstances where Pictish symbols were important. And the Wemyss caves has really played a vital role in this. And you can read more about the results of the excavations in this report, which you can download from the SCAPE website. And very finally, SWACS is a charity, and if you've enjoyed this talk, and even if you can't join us in person, you can still buy some of the great products from the SWACS online shop. You can donate to SWACS, and you can join SWACS as a member, and you'll find all of that information on their website. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks, Mike. I saw that. That's a great question. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is it depends on the time scale. So currently, the sliding cave is, if there wasn't the mound of material in front of the sliding cave, at very high tides and in certain weather conditions, the sea would enter the cave because of where it is, right on the beach edge. The next most at-risk cave is Jonathan's Cave, which again has a little bit of coastal defence in front of it and quite a lot of material piled up in front of it, so that's protecting it for the moment. Then Dew Cave and Court Cave, which they were actually more at risk in the past, but there has been coastline changes in the last 100 years, so they're now further away from the sea. And also Court Cave and Dew Cave do have coastal defences in front of them, so they're not at risk now. Will that do?
Yeah, that's great. I think perhaps people didn't hear me ask the question to you, so I'll ask it again so people understand what you were answering. The question was, are all the caves at risk from coastal erosion? We've got another question come in, and this one is from, if I can find it. This is from Stuart, who wants to know, can we identify what a crescent with a broken lance through it, along with a snake or eel? Can we identify what that means? And do you want to answer that one, or shall I take it?
It sounds like it's a paired symbol, so it's a crescent and V-rod with a snake next to it, which is very common to have a symbol and an animal together. And Mike, I'll now hand over to you to explain what Pictish symbols mean.
I wish I could. This is one of the great debates in the Pictish studies. What exactly do the symbols mean? And we've discussed it before in our previous presentation when we did the live guided tour, and also when we did a question and answer session. And essentially, in a nutshell, nobody can say with any certainty. There are all sorts of theories about what they mean, ranging from they might be sort of protective, it might have originated as sort of protective symbols. There's some evidence that they appeared early on jewellery, etc. There's possibilities that it could be recording important events, it could be recording marriages, it could be declaring ownership of a particular piece of land. I mean, later on, these symbols appear on monumental stones standing in the landscape, which appear to be near boundaries. But as for what the symbols themselves mean, I really think the jury's out on all of these, and there are as many theories really as people that are interested in Pictish history. It's interesting that the form of these changes throughout time. So at Wemyss we have a double disc with a rod through it, and that rod isn't broken. It's continuous straight rod, which is very unusual because in the later symbols that's a broken rod. So I'm afraid we can't really answer that one, just like we can't answer a lot of questions to do with the Picts. But there's some tremendous work going on at the moment to try and get a better understanding of all this, and hopefully that will more light, if possible, will be shed on some of this. We don't actually have any more questions at the moment. Is there anything that you wanted to expand upon, Jo, that you didn't have time to cover in the talk?
Not really. It was a shame that I didn't get a chance to talk about the promontory and the geophysics. So that is all in the report that people can download from the SCAPE website. But in a nutshell, shall I just quickly
why not?
Zip through?
Yeah.
So Mike, you're involved in the promontory.
Yes, well, it was my idea to go and dig on the promontory,
and
you can now explain what we didn't find there.
It was a good idea because all the Pictish activity in the caves means that it's very, very likely that there was settlement, in and around in the area, in the immediate area. And the cliff top is a very good place for a defended
farmstead or settlement or fort even. There is a great big castle up there now, so my money would be on a Pictish fort being underneath the castle. But Mike had a good idea that the promontory next to the castle was also would be very appropriate. I mean, you can see it from the end of the promontory, you have a 360-degree view, so you can, it's easily defended, and it would be great as a lookout post. So we just wondered if there was any evidence of activity there, Pictish or medieval actually, to do with the castle. So we dug a series of test pits along the promontory to see if we could find any archaeological material, and we found more or less nothing. So it was we just found natural sand deposits, which is interesting in itself. That's an interesting geological feature. But we found the only item we found of note was was a sixpence. Can you remember? It was a coin that was broken in half.
It was actually a penny.
Penny.
Yeah, it was a Victorian penny.
Yeah.
And it seemed to have been very deliberately clipped in half. And one of the possible explanations for that is that it was actually a love token, so that there was tradition that when people went away to war or went abroad, they would cut a coin in half, leave one half with the person left behind, and take the other half with them. So quite why somebody decided to leave theirs at the end of the promontory, maybe they just threw it there when the ship sailed away and they went and got on with their life, or maybe it was tragically lost. Who knows? But that was quite an interesting piece of social history. And you're right that we found next to nothing up there. We did also find a 1970s sandwich toaster, an early example of a sandwich toaster. Quite how they thought they would plug it in up there, I'm not sure. But apart from that, certainly no evidence of Pictish activity. We've got another question in from Frank Gibson, who said he was about to ask how the caves fitted into the activity of nearby settlements, but I think you've probably covered that.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to say that we don't have a huge amount of settlement evidence for the Pictish period in the area, which is interesting in itself. But yeah, my money, I think if you could remove the castle, I think there would definitely be some activity predating the castle up there. Another thing to mention actually is when the Picts were using the caves, and even before and a bit after, there was a coastal plain in front of the cave. So we know that the area in front of the caves was farmed, for example, in the Iron Age. So it's almost certain that evidence of settlement has been lost because of coastal erosion.
Okay, thanks. Another question from Frank Feely saying that he's seen pigeon ducats all over Antigua and Barbuda, but never as modified caves. So, do you see these as standalone structures as well in Fife?
Hello, Frank. Nice to see you on the chat. I know Frank. We have, so in Scotland and in the rest of the UK, but particularly in Scotland, actually, maybe just it's a survival thing, we have lots of standalone ducat structures, yes. Some of them are very elaborate because they were a status thing. Not everybody had a ducat. You had to have a lot of land in order to have a ducat. So they are pretty common in the early modern period in Scotland. And I'm looking at the question, never modified caves. Yes, modified caves are really, really rare. In fact, they're probably rarer than caves with Pictish symbols in them. So the ducat is really interesting, which is why we wanted to excavate there.
Yeah, it's also worth saying that there was a standalone ducat right outside below MacDuff's castle, which actually forms part of the scheduled ancient monument for the whole site. But unfortunately, the strong seas that we get in the Firth of Forth don't really pay much regard, don't have much respect for legal protection, and that was wiped out by fierce storms. I think it was there about 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah, and
but there's absolutely no trace of it now.
No, and that's interesting in itself because the ducat just in front of the Wemyss caves was probably 16th century. So that and it probably was maybe replacing the Dew Cave. I mean, this is a theory, we don't know this, but the Dew Cave might be very early. We just don't know.
Yeah, in fact, there's so much we don't know about the Dew Cave. It was one of our targets, obviously, for the excavation last year, and we were planning to go back in there again this year. Unfortunately, our archaeology this summer has been cancelled for obvious reasons, but we certainly want to go back in there and find out more about these floor niches and try and find out the origins of what was going on in the Dew Cave at different periods. I mean, there is also evidence that the actual mouth of the Dew Cave has been deliberately shaped, and quite why that is we don't know. It seems to capture very nicely North Berwick Law on the other side of the Forth, so whether that was deliberate or it was just an expansion of the cave mouth to allow the pigeons to fly out, we don't know, but there's certainly a lot more to learn about that cave, and as Jo says, it's a absolutely unique, well, almost unique example of a medieval Dew Cave, a medieval Dew cut inside a cave. We got a question. I'm not sure who it's from. It's one of our members saying that Gordon Noble was in Sliding Cave. Was there anything in there that tied in with the Time Team excavations?
Absolutely. So we reopened the Time Team trench in order to find the deposit that they had dated to the Pictish period. Gordon and James found the deposit and extended the trench a little bit to get a bit more of it. So yes, we excavated the same sequence of deposits that the Time Team did. Yes.
There's a question from Alex Palmerston that he's seen a suggestion that in the 3rd and 4th centuries there was no agricultural activity in Fife, and that the Sliding Cave evidence is anomalous. Do you have any comment on that?
I would say that I haven't heard that, and I would say that was almost certainly not correct. I mean, we're in the Iron Age period there. The Fife is the breadbasket of Scotland for millennia, actually. If you think about I showed a slide very early on in the talk talking about what we knew about the archaeology of the Wemyss caves from previous excavations, and we have early Iron Age aardmarks in the coastal plain. So I think people have been farming and growing crops in Fife for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think there is an increasing amount of evidence of early medieval Pictish settlements that have previously been unrecognised. For example, in Craig Rock, just outside Upper Largo, a dig in the summer uncovered what seems to be quite a significant Pictish site, and as this was an agricultural society, those sort of settlements would have been completely unsustainable without a large surplus being produced from the agriculture. So I'm not sure where the suggestion comes from, but I'd agree with you, Jo, that it's extremely unlikely.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't see any more questions coming in from the chat, so unless there's anything else you want to add, Jo?
I don't think so, no, I enjoyed that.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for everybody for watching and listening, and we've got several more talks coming up, some of which will concentrate on specific types of activity in the caves, so local history, local stories about the caves, and the industrial activity. So keep an eye out for those. They'll also be on our Facebook page, and we'll keep these going for as long as we're unable to take visitors back to the caves, and we'll announce when we can resume tours, and we're keen to do it as soon as possible. So thank you, everybody, and tune in next time. Keep an eye on the Facebook page for future events, and hopefully we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.